Now, in Ukraine, a major shakeup at the very top of the government has triggered political shockwaves and raised fresh questions about Kiev's negotiating posture with the United States. Now, President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced the resignation of his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, a figure long seen as the president's closest confidant and the country's lead negotiator in talks with Washington. The decision came just hours after anti-corruption investigators conducted search of Yermak's residence. In his nightly address, Zelensky said he was resetting the presidential office, stressing that Russia was waiting for Ukraine to falter during its delicate peace negotiations. Now, Yermak's name was absent from the new list of Ukrainian officials who will take part in the next round of talks with the U.S. Meanwhile, many Ukrainians have welcomed Yermak's departure, expressing relief after months of controversy around him. Now, amid this political turbulence, Kiev once again came under fire. Early Saturday, loud explosions rocked the capital as Russia launched a fresh drone attack. According to the city's military administration, 7 people were wounded and a residential building, along with multiple cars, were damaged. Now, despite the escalating attacks, Zelensky says Ukraine is preparing for upcoming negotiations with U.S. aimed at securing dignified peace with Russia. He emphasized that passing the 2026 national budget remains critical, ensuring Ukraine's defense capabilities and preserving financial stability.
Today I spoke with the President of Finland. Alex informed me about what Russia has said formally and informally, and about the conditions that Russia is putting forward. Now we are preparing for a meeting with the American side to discuss the steps that need to be taken to ensure that peace is truly achieved, and that it is a dignified peace. And when all attention is focused on diplomacy and defense in war, internal strength is needed. Internal strength is the foundation of our external unity and our relations with the world.
The sources say a Ukrainian delegation is set to travel to the U.S. this weekend. Talks may take place in Florida as Washington pushes forward with its own proposal for ending the war. In a related development, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to skip next week's NATO Foreign Ministers meeting, which is a highly unusual absence, especially as allies are preparing to discuss intensive American diplomacy on Ukraine. While Rubio stays away from Brussels, President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected in Moscow for discussions linked to the diplomatic process. In Europe, meanwhile, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has criticized Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán for meeting Russia's President Vladimir Putin without a European mandate.
We have been aware of Viktor Orban's position for years. This is not his first trip to Moscow either. He already made a trip to Moscow in July last year, immediately after taking over the presidency of the European Council. That visit was not only unsuccessful. A few days after this visit, the Russian army launched some of its most violent attacks against civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in Ukraine. But he is acting without a European mandate, and he is doing so without consulting us.
Orbán's 14th visit to Moscow comes despite a series of EU sanctions on Russia and Europe's shift away from Russian energy. He has repeatedly questioned Western military aid for Kiev, straining EU unity. And along a railway outside Warsaw, Polish security forces are stepping up vigilance and patrolling tracks as part of Operation Horizon, launched earlier this month to protect critical infrastructure. The move follows a string of suspicious incidents that Polish authorities say bear the hallmarks of Russian sabotage attempts. All right, to discuss more, we're now being joined by Peter Kusnik from Washington, D.C. He is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University and a defense expert. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. Always a pleasure having you. Now, Yermak was the top negotiator in the peace deal. The question is, what impact can it have on the deal with the top negotiator gone?
You have to realize that Zelensky was already in a very weak position. The Russians had seized Pokrovsk. Russians were making advances on the battlefield. Ukrainian troops were deserting at record numbers. Morale was low. And then on top of that, they're hit by this corruption scandal, which the Ukrainian people see that Zelensky's closest allies have skimmed off $100 million in corrupt expropriation schemes. So Zelensky's popularity has been very much weakened. And then you've got people fleeing and getting fired. Zelensky's business partner fled to Israel ahead of getting arrested. And so with all of this going on, especially in the energy sector, at a time when much of Ukraine only has energy, electricity for a few hours a day, people are just getting fed up. And the question then, we've got this peace proposal, and now Yermak, who is not only chief of staff and top negotiator, but the second most powerful man in Ukraine, is forced to resign after the anti-corruption units investigate his apartment. This is just too much. And so while countries are hesitant to keep giving military aid because the narrative is that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and they're hesitant to keep giving financial aid when you see this massive corruption, Ukraine is in a very, very weak position now in these negotiations. It's sad to watch, but if it brings an end to the fighting, maybe it's worth it.
Right, and then when it comes to political influence, of course, Zelensky is. What kind of effect does it have on Zelensky politically? And now that, is he at a weaker position when it comes to the deal?
He's at a much weakened position. The opposition has rallied in Ukraine around Poroshenko and other opposition parties. They're going to call for a no-confidence vote, very likely, which would mean that the entire cabinet will have to resign, and Zelensky will have to try to put together another cabinet. It's possible that the entire government collapses at this point. So in these negotiations that are taking place, Zelensky, as Trump said back in February to Zelensky, you have very few cards to play. He's got fewer cards to play now than he certainly did then. And it looks like the peace plan, the 28-point peace plan, which was reduced to 19 and now it's 22, certainly favors the Russian positions on a lot of things. So I don't think Zelensky is in a position to bargain very effectively at this point.
Right. Of course, in a related news, I also want your opinion on Marco Rubio. He's the U.S. Secretary of State. He's not going to this NATO meeting that's going to happen. Is there some kind of underlying message that is being drawn here?
Very likely they're sending a signal. Part of the message that we've gotten repeatedly is that Europe is not a major player anymore. Europe was cut out of these negotiations, as was Zelensky in the early rounds. And you look at the position of Merz, Starmer, Macron, Rutte, von der Leyen, Kallas, the European leaders are being portrayed now increasingly as warmongers. Their goal is to keep Ukraine in the fighting. They seem willing to let Ukraine fight to the last Ukrainian. And Ukraine does not have any hope of taking back the land that Russia has claimed and gotten. And so the Europeans are egging the Ukrainians on, even though it's this position Ukraine is in today is stronger than it's going to be in a month from now, or 6 months, or a year. They're just going to lose more territory, more of the economy, more of the infrastructure, more human beings, and it's going to be more of a disaster. But so I don't understand what the Europeans think they're doing in trying to encourage Zelensky and the Ukrainians to keep on fighting on some pipe dream, some myth, some fantasy that they're going to somehow turn this around. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the armaments, and they no longer have the morale to do so. So it's in the best Ukrainian interest to get a deal, even if it's not a good deal. You know, as the Japanese sometimes say in some of my favorite Hiroshima-related movies, an unjust peace is better than a just war. And that's why I feel about Ukraine now. They're only going to be losing more and more. And I think Donald Trump, in his very limited brain, seems to understand that. What Rubio has been one of the people who's been a real war hawk, anti-Russia, anti-China, and the fact that he's being now sidelined is probably a good thing. We want to sideline Hegseth also, who Hegseth had said, we want to get the Ukraine war over with so we can go after the real enemy, China. You know, but this is not the war. This is, as Modi said, this is not a time of war. We need to be finding peaceful solutions.
Well, of course, I hear you, and especially at this point where we see this corruption scandal coming, it almost seems like Ukraine will have to go and get this peace done, because it's not just the war, but it's internal war that is facing right now. Thank you so much, Mr. Kusnik, for joining us on the broadcast and giving your insights.
Thank you for having me.